All right. Today we're going to talk about Yeshua and the Ark of the Covenant, or if you will, Jesus and the Ark of the Covenant. We're going to look at the parallels between Yeshua and the Ark of the Covenant and how the Ark of the Covenant foreshadowed the coming of Yeshua. We're also going to talk about the contents, the things that were contained in the Ark of the Covenant, and how those things pointed to Yeshua and his character and his makeup. Okay, so let's look at Yeshua and compare it to the Ark of the and compare Yeshua to the Ark of the Covenant, comparing Jesus to the Ark of the Covenant. Now, we're going to look at how those things that were contained in the Ark of the Covenant, how the Ark of the Covenant was built, and how all of those things foreshadowed Yeshua HaMashiach or Jesus Christ. Let's look at the first thing. The Ark of the Covenant contained the stone tablets of the commandments. Okay, so those were the commandments that it was the stone tablets that Moses took up on the Mount Sinai, and the commandments were written on those stone tablets. Those are the same stone tablets that were put inside of the Ark of the Covenant. Why is that significant that they were put inside of the Ark of the Covenant? Because Yeshua represented the law. He contained the law within himself. He was the embodiment of the law. He was able to keep the law perfectly while he dwelled on earth. Okay, so having those commandments inside of him represented God's chosen one or God's appointed coming and containing the law within himself. So that's the first parallel. All right. So next we talk about Aaron's staff with the buds. So when we talk about Aaron's staff represented a few different things. First of all, when they were in Egypt, Aaron's staff was one of the staffs that were used. Moses also had a staff, but Aaron had a staff. It was one of the staff that were used to perform different miracles. I believe one of the miracles that were performed with Aaron's staff was turning the water into blood. Okay, so that staff was used to perform miracles. Actually, God performed the miracle, as we know, but he used Aaron used the staff and he put it, on something. There was the same staff that turned into a snake. That God used that staff to, to facilitate, I guess, for lack of a better word, those miracles. We all know that God performed those miracles. So when you look at Aaron's staff, that's one of the significant things about Aaron's staff. Aaron's staff also was significant because once they left Egypt and they were out in the wilderness, they began to bicker at Moses and Aaron. And they were like, how come you guys are the only called ones, and you're the guys that, you're getting special treatment and things like that. So they were bickering at Moses and Aaron. And so Moses could show them that Aaron was chosen. Moses gathered a staff from every head of every tribe. And he also gathered Aaron's staff and he placed those in front of the Ark of the Covenant. Well, what happened next was Aaron's staff budded and it began to flower, and that's how they knew that Aaron was the chosen one. Why is that significant? Because in no other case could that staff that's not planted into the ground or hooked up to anything bud. So they knew it was from God. They knew that that was God's chosen. So they knew that Aaron was chosen of God at that point. So let's look at what Aaron's staff inside of the Ark of the Covenant represented. First of all, it represented the priesthood. Who's our high priest? We have a high priest in Yeshua. Okay? Miracles. It represented those different miracles that were done in the land of Egypt. And then when Jesus came the first time, when Yeshua came, he performed miracles and healings. It also represented deliverance. Okay, that was one of the tools that they used to help deliver them from the land of Egypt. Jesus, Yeshua, is our deliverer. Okay, he's our deliverer. He's our deliverer from sin. It also represented authority. Aaron's staff represented authority because when they put those staffs in front of the Ark of the Covenant and God allowed Aaron's staff to bud, that proved that God had given Aaron authority. Okay, so in turn, it represents God giving Jesus the authority. Okay, what is a staff used for traditionally? A staff is used traditionally to guide a flock. Okay, that's what it's used for traditionally. That's the traditional use of a staff. Who is Jesus? Jesus is our shepherd. Okay, he shepherds us. Okay, we know our shepherd's voice, or we should know our shepherd's voice. And then finally, what did Aaron's staff represent? It represented that he was chosen of God. Okay, and then if you look on how it foreshadowed the coming of Yeshua. Yeshua was the chosen of God. He was the anointed one. He was the promised one that was spoke about in the Old Testament. Okay, next thing, manna from heaven. Okay, looking at the manna from heaven. So while the Israelites, while they were in the wilderness, right, for 40 years, they were fed from the manna from heaven. For 5 days, they collected 1 day's worth of manna. Okay, they couldn't stack the manna because the manna would go bad. On that 6th day, they collected 2 days worth because they needed to eat on the 6th day and they needed to eat on the Sabbath, which is the 7th day. So in order for that to happen, they had to collect twice as much on that 6th day so they didn't have to go out on the Sabbath, because on the Sabbath day, on that 7th day, nothing fell on the 7th day. So in that last day, they had to collect 2 days worth. What does the manna from heaven represent? Well, it represents sustaining. It represents sustaining the people of Israel, sustaining the Israelites. What does Yeshua? Yeshua is our sustainer. He is our bread from heaven. Okay, he is the bread that we're not going to need any other bread. Okay, it also represents God's covenant with us. All right, so that manna from heaven represented our covenant because God was our keeper. He was the one keeping us. So Jesus, or Yeshua, represented the covenant that God made with us to send us the anointed one, to send us our Redeemer, and also the daily bread. When Jesus talks about how to pray, when Yeshua talks about how to pray, he talks about pray only for your daily bread, that daily thing to sustain you. Okay, so those are the parallels with the manna from heaven. All right, the mercy seat. The mercy seat was between the 2 cherubim on the Ark of the Covenant, on top of the Ark of the Covenant. So there were 2 cherubim on either side. In the middle was the mercy seat, and that's where the blood sacrifices went. How does that foreshadow Yeshua? So Yeshua was our ultimate sacrifice. He was the final sacrifice. He was the sacrifice that lasted. No longer do we need to sacrifice bulls and sheep and different animals. Yeshua was that atonement. He atoned for our sins. Okay, he was the final sacrifice that was needed. Many people don't realize this, but when Yeshua resurrected and they came into the sepulcher to see the body, and the body wasn't there, there was an angel at the head and there was an angel at the foot. That represented the 2 cherubim. In the middle represented the sacrifice, which was gone at the time because Jesus had already rose. But in the middle of the 2 cherubim was the sacrifice of God, was Yeshua, who sacrificed himself for us. All right. Next thing. The Ark of the Covenant is covered with gold. What does that represent? For Yeshua, that represents he's the King of Kings. Okay, it represents his royalty. All right, his priesthood, his royalty. It represents him being our king. All right, so that's what that represents. That gold, that fine metal. Next, the Ark of the Covenant was made from shittim wood, or so that wood or that tree grew wild in the desert. Okay, so that tree grew wild in the desert, and that's the wood that they used for the Ark of the Covenant. Well, how does that represent Yeshua? Well, when Herod was having the firstborn killed, where did Joseph, Mary run to? They ran to Egypt. So Jesus came out of Egypt, came out of the desert. So it represents the desert, represents Jesus coming from the desert, represents Yeshua coming from the desert. This next one is pretty interesting. And, I did a lot of research on the numbers, and I was like, well, why did God have to make the dimensions of the Ark of the Covenant 45 inches by 27 inches by 27 inches? what significance that I had. And then I had to actually go back to the Hebrew. And I had to see what those numbers meant in Hebrew and how those numbers represented different things in Hebrew. So, the number 40 plus 5, which equals 45. And then that represented water with no boundaries. What does Jesus say? He says he's our living water. What does Yeshua say? He's our living water. It represents purpose and probation. So he's our purpose. Okay, so Yeshua is our water without boundaries. He's our living water. Okay, and I thought that was really interesting. And then when you look at the 27, if you look in the Hebrew, 20 plus 7, it represents holding, reaching hard, a sword, completeness, and perfection. Well, all of those things represent Yeshua. He was reaching hard for us. He'll come back with a sword. There's going to be a time where Yeshua comes back, and it's not going to be to save. Okay, he's going to come back with the sword. He is complete. Yeshua is complete, and he is the embodiment of perfection. Okay, so when you look at the parallels between the Ark of the Covenant and how it foreshadowed the coming of Yeshua, you can see that there are many different ways that the Ark of the Covenant foreshadowed the coming of Yeshua. I'm sure there are more. I would bet that if you kind of go through it, I would bet you could find more parallels. But those are just kind of the ones that as I was comparing the ones that kind of jumped out at me. So, I welcome all comments. Thank you so much for listening. If you would like to subscribe to my channel, hit the subscribe button, hit the bell so you can receive an alert, every time I post a new video.